Okay, well, we've been tracking through some of the stories in a book written by Mark, one of the early followers of Jesus or early leaders in the Christian church, to prepare us for Easter Sunday. We've called the series A Place for Everyone. So as I say, we actually did Palm Sunday a little earlier. We're a little bit out of whack with the church calendar as such. And today we're getting to the story about his Jesus' arrest and trial, both before the Jewish council and Pilate. But there's just a couple of little bits in the story that I want to show you on a video that bring us from where we were last Sunday to where we are today. Thanks, Jackie and Derek. Sorry, guys, we lost the lip sync there, but it still would have given you the general gist of it. That's actually from the super book that the kids use. Lip sync works out there, I promise. But just I thought a good little way of showing you a little bit of what they have out there and bringing us up to date. I wanted you to think through the Garden of Gethsemane quickly, and then the fact that Jesus was taken before the Sanhedrin for a trial. Okay, I'm going to ask you something before we get into the message. Can you think about a time when you have been treated badly? I'm sure you can. Can you think about a time when you have been misrepresented or wrongly named or blamed for something? And this is the clincher to it, you didn't get a chance to defend yourself or to put it right. If it's a story that's not too personal or painful, I'm going to ask you to just take a minute and share it with someone sitting alongside you, thinking about these questions. How did you feel and what did you do? So have you ever been in a circumstance where you've been unjustly accused? Some people are heading off already. And you didn't get a chance to put it right. How did you feel? What did you do? Take 30 seconds. Hear your own voice again. Okay. It's an awkward question, I know, and if some of our stories we wouldn't be very comfortable to tell out loud, but I hope you perhaps at least thought of something in your head, even if you couldn't share it with anyone around you. Okay, so Jesus had been betrayed by Judas. You saw that played out there with the strange lip syncing on the screen just there. Now, 2 weeks ago, I was in kids' church teaching the kids' church theme for this last few weeks, which has been all around the Last Supper. And we were talking about Judas betraying Jesus. And I thought, I don't know if this question's too hard for these kids, but I said to them, so why do you think Judas betrayed Jesus? Because he'd been friends with Jesus, really close with Jesus. Why would he suddenly betray him? And expecting the kids to say something like, oh, he wanted it for the money. No, they didn't say that. There were some amazing answers. And one little girl, Claire, she said she thought that Judas betrayed Jesus because Judas, too many J's, was disappointed in Jesus. We tend to make out the story of Judas about, he did it for the money. But, Judas had been with Jesus under very poor and difficult circumstances for years. And money had never enticed him before. So what made the money appealing to Judas now? I think she was right. I think Claire was right. Judas was disappointed in Jesus. Judas had hoped Jesus was going to be the king who would lead a mighty army to overthrow the Romans, but all he did was very embarrassing things for Judas and some of the others, like turning the tables over in the temple, super embarrassing things like riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. Kings rode on stallions or in horses and chariots. And then Jesus also had no game plan in his mind of any use, because whenever he did anything amazing, Jesus would tell people, don't pass that on. Don't tell people I'd done that sort of thing. And it's quite likely Judas had got to a point where he was severely disappointed. And he possibly even thought, Jesus is doing more harm for this cause than good. And I wonder if it was something like that incited Judas, if you like, to betray Jesus. So, where we come into the story, Jesus had been betrayed by Judas, and he was arrested by the high priest's men, and he was brought straight to a really hastily convened Sanhedrin or council meeting. The Sanhedrin were Jewish judges. They had quite a lot of authority just over Jewish people, and it was not uncommon for them to hear cases. But it was very uncommon for them to meet at night. But somehow the high priest managed to get enough of them to get the Sanhedrin to meet at night at that late hour. It wasn't their usual practice, as I've said. Not long later, after Jesus had died, when Peter and who was with him? Peter and John, they were arrested. You might recall that story in Acts. They were put in jail overnight, and the Sanhedrin, pulled before the Sanhedrin the next day. And a little later in Jewish history, the Jews themselves actually banned nighttime Sanhedrin council meetings. So they were only held in the day. They probably figured out, actually, not a lot of good happens when you suddenly say, we need a meeting, we need to decide tonight. But anyway, that's what happened to Jesus. The council was called and people were invited to give evidence to prove Jesus was guilty of something. Didn't actually particularly matter what, just something. But the first lot of witnesses, when you read the story, and I'm taking this from Mark 14 and 15 today, the first lot of witnesses were so unprepared in their lives and so contradictory that even the council, who were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus of something, it was too much even for them to, and with good integrity or integrity of sorts, make some case out of it. So they couldn't use what was being said. But then some got up and said, "Oh, we heard Jesus say, 'I will destroy the temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I will build another without human hands.'" So a few people got up and started making these comments. Now, this was also a lie. It was a distortion of what Jesus actually had said. And even this lie, you can see if you read all the gospel accounts, even this lie wasn't consistently put, but it was put together better than the first lot of lies. And it gave the high priest enough of a hook to ask Jesus to defend himself against these charges. Because the temple was a really big deal for the Jews. Any talk of it being destroyed, let alone the implication that it might be rebuilt supernaturally in 3 days, it was just messing with stuff that you ought not to mess with. So the high priest stood up before the council and asked Jesus, "Well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself?" It doesn't tell us this in the story, but I wonder if the crowd of onlookers held their breath at this stage. Maybe hope is not lost. Maybe now Jesus is going to stand up and be the leader of the rebellion that we have been hoping for. About 200 years before the night that Jesus was arrested, there had been a military and social revolution. And the Jews had actually won themselves quite a few freedoms. They'd won the freedom to practice their faith and govern themselves. And the rebellion of 200 years ago, prior to this time, had even remotivated their hopes of being able to put back in a monarchy, a Jewish monarchy, like replace their king. But what they won there after one generation, it started to get lost a little bit. Some of the things they were given were taken back from them. And so the Jews were well and truly ready for another revolution. And if Jesus would just give the word, so many of those people would have been prepared to go home and hammer their farming tools into swords and come back, like you saw Peter do on there, come back ready for the fight. So the high priest says, "So what have you got to say for yourself?" And Jesus was silent. He made no reply. It's not actually very surprising when you stop to think about it. Anyone who can take a little bit of time to reflect on Jesus' life will notice that everything about the way that he'd lived and everything he had taught so far made it pretty unlikely that he would set himself up to be the leader of a nationalistic revolution. In fact, you'd be closer to the truth if you said that out of Jesus' life, you'd say that not only did he not think nationalistic revolution was the answer, he is more likely to think it was part of the problem than the answer. And that's because God had called the nation of Israel into being for this reason. He'd called the nation of Israel into being so that they would show the rest of the people, the rest of the nations of the world, God. The nation of Israel was called into being to be a light so that all people could be pointed to God and to his goodness and to his love and to his plans to reconcile all of creation, all of us, all of the created order. But along the way, Israel got preoccupied, like we so easily do. I get preoccupied with this. Along the way, they got preoccupied not with being the light, but they got preoccupied with their rights as the light. Can you see the difference? Instead of being preoccupied with being the light, they were much more interested in, hey, God chose us, guys. We're the people of God. We're the light. We've got rights. And they got much more preoccupied, I think, with defending those things. It's like they were loud about the wrong things and silent when they should have been speaking. The Jews wanted a Redeemer king to swoop in and save them. Unfortunately, it got to the point they wanted that so that the rest of the world could see that the Jews were special people. They wanted Jesus to swoop in and save them so that the rest of the world would see that they were God's special people. And their preoccupation with this kept them from putting good energy and their loudest voice into actions that show God's love for all people and his plans to reconcile all of creation. And that was actually their main game. That's what the Jews were called to. That was their call, their mission, their ministry, if you like. Very conscious as I was writing this and hearing my own voice. I'm not trying to turn this into a Jew-bashing session. I think it's something human beings do, and I reckon I can see an echo of that in the way that we are today. When we get all worked up about laws and policies and public debates that look to be, and I'm sure in some cases probably will curtail some of our rights as Christian people. I think when we get all too worked up about that, it puts us in danger of being loud about the wrong things, like the disrespect we feel for ourselves and for the church and for God. They're not bad things in themselves, but we get too caught up in that, like I think the Jews were doing, and then we're silent. We're so loud about that and our rights as the church and as Christians that we're silent when we've got something to say that will actually point people to God and his love and his plans to reconcile all of creation. So I thought, I haven't got time to go into this in detail, but just one example from my conversations this week. Euthanasia. Undoubtedly, there's going to be a conscious vote in our state parliament with regards to that. I don't know which way it will go. We could probably make some guesses. But I got to thinking about that, and I thought, we could campaign, as some are doing, loudly against euthanasia, or maybe we could say something about good palliative care. We could be really loud. It's easy to be loud in that. You can't do that. You can't let people choose to end their own lives. And we're silent about the benefits, psychological, spiritual, emotional, physical, of good palliative care. No time to go into that anymore now, but just wanted to give you an example. I think it can be easy to be loud about the wrong things. In this case, Jesus was silent, and he made no reply. He didn't defend himself against false accusations and misunderstandings to do with the destruction and the rebuilding of the temple. The temple had once been the place where God lived, but with Jesus coming wasn't anymore. You know, Jesus actually had his last word on the temple when he turned over the tables, actually, of the money changers. He was saying very clearly that the temple, its people and its practices had ceased to be a light showing God's goodness and love and his plans to reconcile all creation. Only one more thing is said about the temple, and that's at the moment of Jesus' death, when God arranged that the huge temple curtain, I can't do it with your hand, I don't know why I'm doing that, the huge temple curtain was torn in two. Last word on the temple there. So Jesus was silent, and he made no reply. He let the unfair accusations go through to the keeper, because I think he knew that if he was to get into a debate over that, it would be a distraction from the main game. He was silent, and he waited for the right question. But I just want you to not think for a minute that in Jesus' silence there was weakness. It wasn't a weak sort of silence. He was not the leader of a nationalistic revolution, that's for sure. But you know what? Jesus was also not a man who hid away quietly pursuing Bible study and prayer and a devout personal life and, leaving the world to its own devices on the theory that God would deal with all that was troublesome and ugly and difficult and broken. No, Jesus wasn't like that. He didn't lock himself away from the horrors and the difficulties of it all. Jesus, his life had showed that he was always doing things that showed God's goodness and God's love and God's plans. I hope you can almost recite it now, to reconcile all of human creation. In Jesus' company, people got healed and forgiven. People felt loved and cared for. People changed the way they thought about life. People who had been at the bottom economically, physically, socially, morally, spiritually, they had their worlds turned upside down. He wasn't a quiet and distant leader in any way. Jesus overturned the expected order of things. And part of that was he remained silent when, I tell you what, I'd be speaking. I didn't say that about the temple. You can't speak to the Son of God like that. I don't even feel like you can speak to Karen Siggins about that, let alone, he was the Son of God, for heaven's sake. He remained silent when we would expect him to speak. And when everything in us instinctively says, okay, now's the time to be quiet, Jesus, that's when he spoke. When I'd be in self-preservation mode, I can tell you that's when he spoke. So back to the story. We're in about verse 61 of chapter 14 now. The high priest could see the temple argument wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't going to get anything out of that. So the high priest throws something in to try and hook Jesus. And he says, "So, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, the Son of God?" And now Jesus speaks. And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand, and coming on the clouds of heaven." Here, Jesus declares that he is the Messiah, but when the chance of the crowds rising up to kind of enthrone him, that was gone. That moment was gone. He didn't do it back then because he didn't want for that to happen, for the crowds to put him up and put a crown on him and say, "Here he is." So he does it here when there's no chance of the crowds enthroning him, if you like. Here, Jesus declares he is the Messiah in front of an audience who will be outraged, absolutely outraged that he is claiming to be the Messiah. They're outraged for two reasons. Well, there's two things that cause outrage. They're outraged because Jesus has not acted like they expected the Messiah to be, and the Jews were expecting that the Messiah would be a king in their line of kings. He didn't fit any of that in any way. But there was an extra reason that the Sanhedrin were outraged, and their outrage was more intense because Jesus was doing more than claiming to be the Messiah in the sense that the Jews understood it. He was claiming to be the Son of God, and you can see that in the sentence there where he talks about coming on the clouds to be part of the judgment. That was Jesus elevating himself to the position of God's own Son. The Jews were expecting a human king to be their Messiah. Jesus was saying, "I am that Messiah, and I am the Son of God." Not the sons of God in the sense that kings were considered to be, the Son of God. Oh, listen to that beautiful rain. Perfect for a sausage sizzle. They're undercover, I see. Not only can we smell it, I can actually see them there now. This is getting worse and worse. Okay, back to the point. It's a very important thing that the son of God a king was considered a son of God, is what I'm trying to say. So Jesus was not only saying he's the Messiah they were looking for, but he was saying his sonship was divine. It wasn't just that he was in the Davidic line and could be called a king in that way. So his fate was sealed in that moment. And the high priest tore his clothes to show his horror and said, "Why do we need any other witnesses? You've all heard this blasphemy. What is your verdict?" he asked the Sanhedrin. "Guilty," they cried. "He deserves to die." And then some of them began to spit at him, and they blindfolded him, and they beat him with their fists, and they jeered at him, "Prophesy to us. Who hit you? Who hit you?" And the guards slapped him, and then they took him away. And you know what? Jesus was back to silence now. Do you want to know perhaps the most moving thing about this silence? If Jesus had spoken, he might have pointed out to the jeering, spitting, slapping, taunting people that everything they were doing had been prophesied about him. Wow. Jesus let it go through to the keeper. It would have been a distraction, I guess. An unnecessary debate on the way to the main game. So the Sanhedrin delivered Jesus to another court because the Sanhedrin they could hear Jewish situations. They could order someone to be whipped or to have to pay money, do a whole pile of things, but they didn't have the authority to put someone to death, and that's what the high priest wanted. So they handed Jesus over to the Roman governor's court now, and they wanted to be rid of him. "He deserves to die," they'd cried. He actually didn't, though, did he? Jesus didn't deserve to die. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story of Jesus standing before Governor Pilate, but I'm actually going to ask the band to come back up and get themselves in place as we do that, and you'll see why in just a moment. So we're in chapter 15 of Mark now, if you're following it. And Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus is not silent here, although he speaks very few words. Jesus replied, You have said it. Are you the king of the Jews? You have said it. And then the priests start, you can almost imagine them, and they get out their phones if they had them, get out a scroll, it was all in their minds, I'm sure. They started with this huge list of crimes that Jesus was accused of, and the story says that Pilate was surprised. And I'll tell you why he was surprised, because he'd figured out by now that the only thing Jesus had done wrong was get the high priests and the rabbis envious, jealous of his authority and his power. So even Pilate knew this list of things it was lies, it was rubbish. And so he says to Jesus, you can imagine him almost like prompting here, okay, Jesus, you're going to say something back to this? We all know this is not the truth. Jesus is silent again, much to Pilate's surprise, the story says. So then Pilate's kind of on his own trying to save this guy, and he tries to win Jesus a get-out-of-jail-free card, but the crowd is now whipped up by the Sanhedrin, and they're not having any of that at all. And they shout back at Pilate, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And so Pilate handed Jesus over to the Roman soldiers, who dressed him in a purple robe, purple for a king. They made thorn branches into a crown, and they put it on his head. They saluted him, and they taunted him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they hit him on the head with a reed stick, and they were trying to get him to, who hit you, who hit you? They spat on him, and they dropped to their knees in mock worship of him. And they did that till they got tired of the game. Don't know how long that was. They did it till they got tired of the mockery, tired of the jeering. And then they took Jesus away to be killed. And Jesus, the story says, was silent. I bet there was some noise, though. I bet there were some groans of pain, some of that involuntary crying out that we do when we are being hurt. Some sobs. Jesus was fully human, remember, there must have been some noise. But the comment about Jesus being silent was that he remained silent. He deliberately remained silent. He spoke no intentional words into that space. The only sound you would have heard was the sound of the slapping and the mocking and Jesus' own grunting as he carried his cross, and his own sobs, his own drawing of breath, his own involuntary crying out in pain. Didn't say anything deliberate or intentional. He let that go right through to the keeper. Because to defend himself was to cause a distraction to the main game. So Jesus of Nazareth, he went to his death, believing that his death was part of God's plan to show his love and goodness and to reconcile all of creation, you and me, yes, but all of creation, all people, to himself. So I want to just leave you with this image. Jesus was two things. He was fully man and fully God. I can't begin to understand that, but I believe it. So Jesus, the man, was a man who desperately wanted the wheel of human history to turn. Can you imagine human history as a wheel? It's been set in motion by things that have happened, and it's turning, and it's turning, and it's turning, and there's no doubt it's heading towards one outcome. Not a good outcome, either for human beings or for all of God's beautiful created order. And Jesus, the human being, wants that wheel to change. But he knows no amount of straining on the wheel or trying to build a new track in front of the wheel is going to change that wheel. It's got some momentum. It's going on and on and on towards its inevitable outcome. And Jesus, the man, wants that wheel to change. But Jesus, who is God, knows in his heart of hearts that wheel's not changing direction. That wheel's not changing direction based on any human effort. It's not going to change direction without some extraordinary intervention. And I found, a beautiful definition of that intervention. It's written by Albert Schweitzer over 100 years ago, actually. He explained it like this. He said, the wheel of human history was moving on and on and on in a particular direction. And Jesus Christ, get this bit, Jesus Christ, the wheel is moving. Give you a minute, it's just a bit of drip of rain there. The wheel is moving, human history, the wheel is moving on and on and on. Jesus Christ threw himself into the wheel, and the wheel crushed him. The wheel broke him. But I tell you what, the wheel changed direction. The wheel changed direction. This was the main game that prompted Jesus to choose silence in many situations and to speak in others. Jesus threw himself into the wheel to defeat evil and to alter the direction of history so that we and all of God's creation can know something of the love and goodness of God and be reconciled to him. Can you see that? You see the enormity of that? I reckon Jesus' silence roars when we see that he did this to make a place for everyone. Don't you think? I think his silence roars when we realise that he threw himself into the wheel. It crushed him and he changed the course of human history. We're going to think a lot more about that in the next few days leading up to Easter. And I know we often end our services, we like to get to the point in the message where there's some, okay, so how's this going to change how I live my week this week? Well, I couldn't get past the fact that I think our only and best response to what we've heard this morning, to the roaring silence of Jesus, is to actually stand together and worship him. Because our Messiah deserves more than the rocks having to call out. So I'm going to invite you to stand and we're going to worship our Father God together. We're going to thank him for Jesus. That is our good and fitting response to what we have heard today.